There we go. Yes, I have been listening to a lot of the talks here and looking at the ones that are coming up, and they're all very promising because they talk about how people are going to live long and healthy and happy lives, and much longer healthy, happy lives, in fact, than most of us have been able to imagine until very recently. However, there are many of us in this room, myself included, who are older than optimal and are not likely to be able to take advantage of these new developments and therapies. We are what I would call the Moses generation. Those of you that are familiar with the Old Testament remember that Moses led the Israelites through the wilderness for 40 years to the Promised Land, but God wouldn't let him see it. No, he'd let him see it, but he wouldn't let him visit. He could see the Promised Land from the mountaintop, but he died before he got there, and everybody that lived there from time immemorial owed their presence there to what he did. Some of us, Mrs. Garan, for instance, myself, a few others, may be the Moses generation. We're not going to live long enough to take advantage of the therapies that we are developing. And so because of that, we need to consider a plan B. Plan B, you've heard some people talk about so far today, or yesterday, is cryopreservation. It's a way of putting the natural process of death on hold long enough for science to catch up with our aspirations, and indeed allow us to come down off the side of the mountain and enter the Promised Land ourselves. Now, for that purpose, we have cryonics, cryopreservation. And I'd like to talk to you today about cryonics. It is a very promising technique. It's been around for actually quite a long time. We have in this room Steve Garan from TransTime, who runs a cryonics company. I happen to consult for them as well. And the whole concept of cryonics is to help you take advantage of the science that is right now being developed. People think of it as a scientific method of, bringing you back from the dead. And it is indeed a promising industry, but it needs to be portrayed as something more than that. The public doesn't really understand why this science fiction technique of putting you into a box full of liquid nitrogen or a cylinder full of liquid nitrogen is really worthwhile. How many people here are signed up to be cryopreserved? Okay, so we've got about 4 of them as far as I can tell. That's not a lot. Could anybody venture a guess as to how many people have actually signed contracts to become cryopreserved or who are under cryopreservation right now? Steve, you don't count, you know. Anyone else? Okay, I'll just let you in on the secret. It's about 4,000 people. 4,000 people worldwide. This is a very promising technology, but it's not what you call a popular technology. Now, if we look at it as science, if we look at it as, science fiction, everybody says, yeah. But if we look at it differently, if we market it differently, if we consider it not to be some marvelous scientific method of bringing you back from the dead, but rather in the normal, ordinary manner of other methods of funeral care, then all of a sudden people start to realize this applies to their own lives. What we need is a new method of storing people's physical remains after death, however that might be defined. Oh yes, I get one of these, that's cool. Now, cryopreservation is a way of doing that. You have to do something with your loved ones and with yourself when you die. Right now, we don't like to think about that. Some of us, we reach a certain age, or we confront a potentially fatal illness, or most of us will lose our parents, or some of us will lose our children, and we all have to confront this. Most people don't think about cryopreservation, even though there is something fundamentally different about cryopreservation relative to all of the other methods. It's the only method that has the possibility of reanimation. And that is something that people have to bear in mind. Now, it is a problem to market cryopreservation to the broader market. And by the broader market, I mean 4,000 people is our market right now. That's not a broad market, believe me. We fit 300 people in this room. Okay, so worldwide, only 4,000 people are signed up to be cryopreserved. How do we market this to the broader market when the main problem is that it doesn't work? At least not yet. You see, fundamentally, no living mammal has ever been cryopreserved and brought back. So here's our problem. The solution, as I see it, is to market cryonics not as a path to reanimation, but as a viable alternative to all of the other methods that are out there for taking care of your dead. I know that sounds very brutal and it sounds very 18th century, but that is what we need to do. Now, in order for all of us as transhumanists, as futurists, as life extensionists, to help the world understand that this technology is valuable, is viable, and is available, we have to forget about the science fiction aspect of it for a while and compare it to other methods of funeral care. We have to promote reanimation not as the primary goal of cryonics. Steve, I can see, is getting ready to strangle me here, but it's not the primary goal. The primary goal is to figure out what to do with your grandmother when she dies. And there are lots of different options, and historically, people have been dying for a very long time. In fact, we may be at the verge of a place where people aren't dying anymore, but right now it's the norm. We have to promote reanimation not as the primary goal, but as a valuable secondary benefit that will accrue if science progresses the way we believe it will. In fact, the way we are almost certain that it will right now. Essentially, what we have to do is treat cryopreservation not as a promise of reanimation, but as a possibility of reanimation. But otherwise, we have to look at it just like any other method of funeral care. And trust me, every single person in this room is going to have to find a good, viable method of funeral care for somebody, somewhere in their lives, even yourselves. I have my plans written out. I don't want my son to have to figure them out. Great. Fine. Now, people say this is impossible, but it's not really. We have some very tantalizing hints from nature these days. These are all fairly recent, in fact. We have wild alligators that froze last winter in North Carolina. When it got so cold there, unseasonably cold, that reptiles in swamps froze solid. The swamp, basically, the pond froze around them. Apparently, alligators are genetically designed to poke their noses through the ice before it freezes and freeze along with them. They've been frozen for a day or more. I mean, this is like, frozen, rock solid, ice. And then when things warm up, they warm up again. Now, these are reptiles, you say, and reptiles are fundamentally different. You and I don't look anything like an alligator. Okay, there's also the recent case of Fluffy the cat, who was living in Montana. About the same time, a huge cold snap came through. Fluffy was a motion-compromised cat. She couldn't walk very well. She got stuck outside in a huge, freezing snowstorm. And by the time they brought her in, about 3 hours later, she was so cold that they couldn't measure her body temperature. Nothing they had in the veterinarian's office could tell you how cold this cat was. There were no vital signs. She was solid. And somebody said, hey, let's give it a shot. So they brought her back very slowly, very carefully, using warm water and hair dryers and time and a warm room. And Fluffy the cat is still alive and happy today. It's almost a year later. And there's no obvious reason why she shouldn't live the life of a normal cat. Again, you say cats, mice, alligators, right? Well, we have people. Dr. Anna Bagenholm was actually 20 years ago. She was a physician in Norway who was cross-country skiing with some other physician friends. And Dr. Bagenholm slipped, tripped, fell, landed face down under a sheet of ice in a flowing stream in Norway in the middle of winter. And she was in there for over 2 hours. It took them that long to get a helicopter out, lift her out. She had medical care from the moment her face hit the water because all of her friends were doctors. But there wasn't much they could really do. So they left her there, called in the medevac helicopter, brought her back to a hospital. Her lowest core body temperature, as far as they could measure, was 13.7 degrees Celsius. You Americans in the audience can translate that for yourselves. And the doctors in Norway basically applied a premise that has now become fairly common. It's the maxim that you're not dead unless you're warm and dead. If you are cold, you're not really dead. You are effectively in stasis. Dr. Bagenholm was brought back. She suffered minor nerve injury, but she's still practicing medicine today in Norway. We have clear understanding that this could work. Now, we're in a specialized audience here, a select group of people. Everybody understands that you can freeze things and bring them back and make use of them. In fact, we do this all the time. Now, I'm sorry, I forgot about this one. This one is really interesting. This has nothing to do with freezing anything. Some medical students at Yale University decided they would find out what happened if they went to a slaughterhouse, acquired about 20 pigs' heads, and cut out the brains to see if they could perfuse them with nutrients and what would happen to the brain cells. They found something truly remarkable. Pig brains kept at ambient temperature for hours can still be brought back to a state of brain activity. Not full-fledged brain activity, but this is a tantalizing concept. The abstract of this, if you can't read it, says the brains of humans and other mammals are highly vulnerable to interruptions in blood flow, but that they were able to essentially bring them back. It partially revives unpreserved brain cells for up to 4 hours beyond death. Now, if you can do that at room temperature with normal brain cells, freezing them looks all the more promising. And we do this a lot. We have a whole list of current applications. There's about 24 of them, more or less. But the ones that you guys are probably familiar with are the ones that effectively amount to freezing the human precursors. We've got oocytes, human eggs, spermatozoa, and actual embryos. People are frozen. Steve pointed out yesterday that there are about 4 million people who are walking around today who were frozen at one point in their life. That was a very early stage. Cryonics allows us to do this with any of us in this room. Now, can we promise that you'll be brought back? No, we can't. But the concept of reanimation, the concept of bringing people back from the dead, goes back almost as far as people themselves. We have a solution, again, here, which is to market cryonics not as a path to reanimation, but as one more in the long chain of methods that we have had to preserve people or to just dispose of people. Many of these have actually had the intention of reanimation, or at least bringing people back in one fashion or another. And again, this is not a promise. It's a possibility. So let's look at some ancient methods. The oldest one we know of is Paleolithic burials. It's a ritual burial where people were buried with ornaments, tools. They were painted with ochre so that their skin looked nice and red and rosy. Now, why did people bury tools with their dead? And this is thousands of years ago. Stone tools are extremely useful if you're living in a primitive environment. In fact, they're probably, next to fire, the most important tool that you have to keep from dying young. If you take a stone tool and you bury it in a hole with your great-uncle Thag, you don't use that anymore. Why would you take something so valuable and bury it with Thag if you knew that Thag wouldn't need it anymore? You'd keep it for yourself. Gee, Uncle Thag, can I have your favorite stone axe? Okay, fine. But they did. You can see here in this picture, there are shells, there are ornaments. I'm not even sure what those are, but they look like tools to me. The cost of this was labor-intensive, but it otherwise didn't cost very much. You had to get somebody to dig a hole, lay out the body, ornament it, do all that. The reanimation probability was probably perceived, but we don't really know. What we know is that valuable stuff was put in that hole with those people. And nobody living in a harsh environment would give up valuable stuff unless they thought there was a reason. Okay, there are other ways to deal with this as well. We have the traditional Tibetan sky burial method, which is charming. You take your body, you drag it out on the side of a mountain, you leave it there to be eaten by vultures. Okay, you come back in a few weeks and there's nothing there but bones. At least you know that, Uncle Thampa or whatever has been properly returned to the elements and his spirit has gone to wherever. This has been done again for many thousands of years. The problem with sky burial is you need a large amount of space and quite a number of cultures. So technology has applied to create a more modern method of sky burial. It's called a dakma. And in cities like Mumbai, for example, many Indian cities, you just don't have enough space to drag people onto mountaintops. So they've created this artificial method of allowing the vultures to eat their bodies. Again, these are fairly grim photos, but let's be real here. People die, they don't look like much when they do, and this is just how it works. But you can see there's quite a few bodies here, and there's an oculus, a big central hole. The vultures fly in, they do their thing, and a few weeks later the bones are there, they're distributed. That's nice. It's not exactly my idea of fun, but that's another way of doing it. Now this one is much more interesting. We're all familiar with the Egyptian method of caring for their dead. It is scientific in its own way. The Egyptians were the best scientists of their day, and they applied enormous amounts of thought and care and cost to the mummification of their dead. They were absolutely certain that people would be reanimated. In fact, nobody bothered to build pyramids and fill them full of gold and treasures and tools and your favorite cats and your favorite wives and your favorite slaves and everything else just because they thought you were dead and gone and would never need them anymore. They put these things there because they were bloody certain that you were coming back. In fact, there are Egyptian texts that show that they even had a cost-benefit analysis. The more money that you spend, the more likely you are to be reanimated. So this was the scientific method 4,000 years ago. Now today we get to modern methods. We're all familiar with these, really. Cemetery burial, very much like the Egyptian burial. They drain your blood, they replace it with a protective fluid, they put you in a box, they bury you in the ground, and we were supposed to not decompose, but you really do about 20 years later. Very few people actually find that out because nobody digs up a casket 20 years later to see if somebody's decomposed. That's really it. Now, the cost of a cemetery burial is about $14,000, average maximum. The reanimation probability, as we all know, is 0. $14,000, though, is cheap. A lot of people spend a lot more. Princess Diana, perhaps an icon, her funeral was $11.8 million. Pope John Paul was slightly less. Margaret Thatcher was $5.3. But even Michael Jackson was $1 million. Now, we'll leave aside the questionable morality of Mr. Jackson. Imagine that you attended Michael Jackson's funeral. Imagine you were told that of the $1 million that they spent, they'd cut a few corners, put aside $150,000 to have him cryopreserved, and that this massive funeral you were about to attend was on the cheap at a mere $850,000. Would anybody notice? No, but cryopreservation could have been in that budget. And Michael Jackson or anybody else with $1 million funeral would have the possibility of reanimation. Oh, come on, move. Thank you. We have others as well. Burial at sea is basically sky burial with water. The cost of burial at sea is negligible, assuming you have a boat. You put the body in a bag or a box, you weight it down, and you throw them into the ocean to be eaten by sea life. Not much different from being eaten by vultures. It's slightly primitive, but it can be fairly ceremonial if you look at it that way. We have cremation. Everybody knows that. They put you in an oven. They roast you at a hugely high temperature. You burn down to your bones. And then this is the part that people forget. They take the bones, they put them in a grinder to create that nice fluffy ash that everybody expects, because bones don't burn very well. The cost of cremation is about $500,000, $10,000, depending. The reanimation probability, as we know, is 0. Now, we have emerging funeral methods, and emerging funeral methods are a little more intriguing. Some of them go right back to the basics. There's the green burial. It's like the Paleolithic burial. You dig a hole in the ground, you put Uncle Albert in the hole in the ground, and you leave him there. And he decomposes. Effectively, he gets eaten by nature, just like the sky burial, just like the sea burial. Not particularly pleasant. And we also know that the reanimation probability of dumping your dead in a hole in the ground is essentially 0. Okay, there's a more modern way of doing this. They call it recomposing, which effectively means you help the process along in a nice, pleasant environment, and it's the same end. You wind up as dirt. The reanimation is probability. The cost, nobody's sure of yet because nobody's actually done this. This is a very modern method. We have a tree burial where they put you in a biodegradable pod. They plant a tree on the top of it. The roots come through. About nobody really knows yet. $500 to maybe $5,000. The reanimation probability, again, is 0. We know that. And this one, I love it. Alkaline hydrolysis. Put somebody in a bath of lye. Heat them up to high temperature under high pressure, and everything dissolves but their bones, which again need to be ground up into that fine fluffy powder that everybody expects, but which is really just a marketing technique. So what you're getting at here is that there are lots of ways to do things. Marketing techniques have a lot to do with all of them. Then this one, cryopreservation as the scientific method of funeral care. And I'd like to trademark that. In fact, I'm claiming it as a trademark. I haven't filed it yet, but anybody who's thinking about it, this is my trademark, the scientific method of funeral care. Because we are offering one more method of taking care of a body, just like everything else. Very much like embalming, very much like the Egyptian mummification process. Blood is drained, it's replaced with a cryoprotectant solution. The body's put in a container. That container is stored not in the ground, not in a pyramid, but in a tank of liquid nitrogen, something below 200 degrees Celsius, minus 200 degrees Celsius. Now here's where it gets interesting. The perceived reanimation probability is highly dependent on the user. If you're going to spend this kind of money, you better believe that there's some benefit to it, or you might as well have yourself dumped in the ocean in a weighted sack. The actual probability is unknown, but it's increasingly promising. You've seen my examples there. We have reason to believe that this will be done, and done fairly quickly. Until it is, the process puts you in stasis. You don't deteriorate once you're frozen in liquid nitrogen, and one of two things is going to happen. Either you're going to stay there until the second coming, or you're going to be revived and reanimated as planned. And maybe that will work, maybe it won't. If it does, you got a benefit that's greater than anything else we have ever had available for caring for our dead. And that's very promising. Now, the cost of cryonics, well, somewhere under $200,000 for the high-end ticket, Alcor, TransTime, that's Steve's company. There's about $150 for whole body preservation. Cryonics, a Russian company, will do a body for $36,000 and a head for $18,000. Cryonics Institute, $35 to $28,000. There's a company in China, the Yinfeng Biological Sciences Institute, with an unknown cost. But you see, there is an industry surrounding this technology, and it's there because people really think we can do something with it. Now, the cost is still very high compared to, let's say, sky burial, where you drag somebody onto a mountainside and leave them to be eaten by birds. But you're not coming back when you're eaten by birds. You're probably not coming back when you're buried at sea or buried under a tree or dumped in a hole in the ground or any of these. There is only one method, this is considered the whole package of cryonics, that gives you a chance at something more. And that's what we do. So, come on, move. Is there a difference between any of these methods? Well, I can tell you one thing. This is the expensive route. You know, the casket, the gold, the jewels, the pyramid, all that. It costs a lot more than $150,000. I can promise you that. But the people who did this did it because they believed. In fact, they were certain that it was worth it. And people today face that same choice. The only difference is they have a better scientific basis for understanding that this will work. Now, an urn is cheap, but you're not coming out of the urn. Same thing with a casket. And then we have our doer, which is kind of beautiful in its own way, and it's not fundamentally distinct from this sarcophagus. You take the body, you preserve it, you put it someplace, and you hold it until the reanimation. Thank you. So, we've got a new marketing strategy. You have to acknowledge cryopreservation as a viable funeral method, just like every other. You have to put it in the list of things that you consider. You can say, well, I could be buried, or I could be cryopreserved. I could be cremated, or I could be cryopreserved. Put it on the list of possibilities. Tell all your friends that that's an option. It's an expensive option, sure it is, but you get a benefit from it. You absolutely do. You have to understand the alternatives. That's why you saw all these lovely pictures of people being eaten by vultures and buried in Dakma and all that. You have to address the ick factor that these other methodologies create. Nobody likes to think about being burned in an oven or dissolved in pressurized hot lye or eaten by vultures or dumped in the ocean or mummification for that matter, but they are the options. So we compare prices apples to apples, including long-term storage, and say, this is what it will cost you if you want some hope of reanimation. Otherwise, go ahead, have yourself burned. It's cheap and easy. We need to emphasize reanimation not as the primary goal, but as an important secondary consideration. Once cryopreservation is viewed on a level playing field with every other method of caring for your dead, then we can examine it not as some wonderful science fiction possibility, but as an actual alternative to everything else we've got. And people will be able to consider it, like everything else. Now, come on, thank you. The problem with this is that there is always some knee-jerk response that says that any method of disposing of a dead body, any new method, anything that you didn't use for your grandfather or your grandmother, will automatically be rejected because people just don't like it. Now, that is a normal human process, There was a song in here that was supposed to be played, but I don't get audio. It's an old gospel song, "Give me that old-time religion." You probably heard it before. And the song goes, it's good enough for Father, it was good enough for Mama, it was good enough for whoever, and it's good enough for me. The old methods are not good enough for me. I don't think they're good enough for you. And they're certainly not good enough for the rest of the world. There are only 4,000 people right now. 4,000 out of 8 billion people who are taking advantage of this new method. And it's available. Now, it's up to us as proponents of better ways of doing things to make it clear to people that this is an option. It's a real option. It's a good option. We cancel out the ick factor, and we compare these things one by one by one, and we wind up with a clear comparison. What we wind up with is that cryonics is the scientific method of funeral care. It's not a promise. It's a possibility, and that's a trademark. Does anybody have any questions? All right, somebody's got to have a question.
Actually, I don't have a question, but I have something to add.
Are you going to throw something at me?
Cryonics is not just for older people to get a contract. I'm speaking as someone who has gotten a contract at 24. It is much more affordable, the younger you are, to get life insurance to fund cryonics.
Yes, thank you. I forgot to mention that you can get financing for this. It's actually quite simple. You buy a life insurance policy, and as Christine pointed out, go ahead.
And when you're that young, it's something that almost everybody can afford. At 24, I was a student. I did not have a lot of money, and a lot of young cryonicists, you get life insurance. It costs you, like in the US. Yeah, in the US it's like that. For me it was 83 euros, but it's something that most of us can afford. It's not just for the rich, it's not just for older people, it's for everybody. Yeah.
That's absolutely right, thank you. And I should point out that when you say it's not just for the rich, Ray Kurzweil once observed that the rich always get the best technology first, usually before it's perfected. So trickle down is important. Does anybody remember what the first cell phone looked like? It weighed about 3 kilos. It was too big to put in a pocket. It was too big to put in a purse. And it made phone calls. That's all it did. Now look at it. Rohit.
So Paul, quite a few people have talked about cryonics being, if you like, the gap closure measure between where we are today and these life extension technologies coming to fruition. But how long do you think it will take till we have effective reanimation techniques with cryonics?
That's a good question. At the moment, nobody really knows. We have been getting better and better at freezing people, at preserving them, if you will. But nobody's ever brought anybody back from the dead, except that we have our esteemed Dr. Garan here, who may know more about this than I do. Yeah. Sir.
Just want to make a comment. Actually, the answer to your question doesn't matter because chemistry really doesn't take place at that temperature, so there's really nothing happening, and so you can stay that way for technically ever. So the wait time is sort of irrelevant if you're frozen, how long it takes, because really time doesn't exist when you're frozen. It just passes you by. So when you're frozen, you wake up, there's no time perceived. So it will happen. We don't know when, but it will. Pretty certain about that.
Yeah. I think that the analogy you might make is when you go to bed at night, how long are you going to sleep? Does it matter to you if you sleep 3 hours before you wake up or 12 hours before you wake up? You go to sleep, you sleep for as long as you sleep, and then you wake up, hopefully refreshed, and in the case of cryonics, renewed. But the time it takes to get from going to bed to waking up is downtime, as far as you're concerned. You don't notice it. You don't really care. You don't get bored. You're sitting there at minus 196 degrees Celsius. You know, you're stable. And if it takes 2 years or 10 years or 200 years or 1,000 years, it won't matter to you as long as when you're reanimated well. Yes, Alex.
Yeah, thank you,
Oh,
Paul.
sorry.
I had a conversation with Natasha Vidamore about 6 months ago over a whiskey, and I said to her, like, just between you and I, Natasha, what do you think are the chances that the reanimation process will work, you will be thawed out and back? She was like, Denisa, you know, I think it's around 90%. Like, it's really good. Like, so what is your take on this? Like, what are the chances, like, you can sense, you know, the science? I'd love to hear from you.
I'm going to be very, very bold here. I'm going to say it's about 100% because technology will continue to expand. And like I said, your cryopreserved, intact. So everything is there. In fact, myself and Nuno published a paper back in April about neuro-nanorobotics and basically any physical damage within the cells and so on will be able to be fixed by nanorobots and so on and so forth. So I know this is kind of a bold statement, but you're completely intact, and as you said, you're not changing. So time is really on your side, and technology will just keep on going, getting better and better.
And I'm going to stop this session now, and we're going to thank Paul.
Thank you.